The overnight bus ended up being 12 hours long, and then it took about an hour to get through border control and get our passports stamped, and then it was straight onto another 6-hour bus journey to get from Tulcan to Quito. And luckily for Hungry Jack, there were vendors on the bus selling horrible burgers for $1. We ended up getting to our hostel at about 4 o'clock, and we stayed at the Secret Garden. And as you probably expected, after a quick shower and turnaround, we were out exploring the city before it got too dark. We were only walking around for a couple of hours, but even in that time the city impressed us. Lots of old grand buildings with massive mountains serving as the backdrop. We quickly noticed that we felt a lot more unfit than usual, and that's because Quito is 2,850 metres above sea level, which is the highest city that we've been to so far, so even walking up a slight hill you could feel it way more than usual. But this was definitely the highlight of our little wander around the city, the Basilica del Voto Nacional, a monumental 19th century Catholic church lighting up the city. It was then time to go back to the hostel and straight to bed, because we had nothing left in the tank.
We woke up to enjoy the morning views from our hostel, and that morning we planned to take Quito's cable car up the mountain for some city views, but instead we had an amazing trip to the ear doctor, as our dip in the Amazon River had given Beth an ear infection, so she was given some ear drops and advised not to swim for the next 7 days, just in time for our week-long trip to the Galapagos the next day. After our meeting with Dr. Ear, we raised Beth's spirits with a journey inside the basilica, which turned out to be 16 stories tall and was fun at first, but then combined with the altitude it wasn't quite so good a time, but once we made it to the roof it was worth the effort. The views of Quito were absolutely mind-blowing, along with views of the basilica itself, which started its construction in 1884 and isn't technically complete, as a local legend suggests. On its day of completion the world will end, so it's probably best they don't finish it. We enjoyed a canelazo, Ecuador's equivalent to a mulled wine. Then we continued our tour of the roof, going along this delightful hallway until we reached the next tower. From here we got more beautiful views of the basilica, but to reach the top we had to go up these massive stairs, and after a short appreciation of the views, we had to take the very steep stairs back down again. We took in these fantastic views of the inside of the church, along with this smashing stained glass window. Then we headed back to our accommodation, jumped on a bus, and headed for the equator line, where we saw these real-life shrunken heads, which was quite unexpected. Then came the real challenge, balancing an egg on a nail, which apparently is easier to do on the equator. And as always, Beth absolutely nailed it. And clearly with the competitive nature of our relationship, I couldn't let her be the only one. In total, only 5 people managed to balance the egg, and in return for this unique skill, we were presented certificates by our tour guide, which will be getting framed when we get back home and added to our LinkedIn profiles, as we are now official egg masters. Our next task was to see where we were more drawn, the north or the south. Turns out Beth's a southerner all along.
I would like to let the records show that this test had actually been debunked and it is a load of rubbish. Yorkshire. It was then time for an early night because we were up at 3 a.m. the next morning, as it was time to fly to the Galapagos. It took an hour to get to the airport and about 3.5 hours flying, featuring a stop in Guayaquil and Jack doing my eardrops. You would think it would be a short flight because on a map it looks like it's just off the coast of Ecuador, but it's actually pretty much the same distance as flying from Leeds Bradford to Munich. When we landed it was about 8 degrees hotter and sunny, and we'd actually booked our Galapagos trip through a local tour operator, so Jack's dream was already fulfilled when we saw a man holding a sign with his name on at the airport. As soon as we left arrivals, there was a random fat iguana just outside, so we already knew this was going to be a good trip. We had a short bus to the water taxi,
where the bus stopped to allow us to take in these impressive views. Then it was a short 5-minute boat ride to cross from Baltra to Santa Cruz Island. Our first stop on the island were these massive sinkholes called the Twins. Originally they were ginormous lava chambers, but once the lava disappeared, the roofs caved in, leaving these 280 metre deep craters. Next up was the giant tortoise reserve. These absolute lumps can live up to 170 years old, which is unsurprising when all they do is sit, eat lots of grass and sleep. Oh, and do these absolutely massive poos. Interestingly, these tortoises are not native to the island. The 15 species in the Galapagos are relatives of a South American tortoise that managed to float the whole way over here.
The final stop of this tour were the lava tunnels, formed when molten lava flowed beneath the surface and the outer layer solidified while the interior lava continued to flow out, creating empty tubes, and this one was 400 metres long. It was then time to head to the accommodation, where we checked in at El Paraíso, complete with a turtle-shaped towel. And then we headed out for a little wander around the town, where we were immediately greeted by this pile of marine iguanas. and then these seals having a playful scrap on the high street, not bothered by anyone stood near them.
The next morning we were up early for our boat trip, but it turned out my phone hadn't updated the time, so we headed back to bed for another hour. We jumped on our bus and headed for the harbour, and after a short dinghy ride we arrived at our yacht, and were given a very basic breakfast to start the day, and after around 2 hours of sailing we finally arrived. The island is one of the youngest in the Galapagos, and is made up of two types of lava, Paihoi and A'a lava, which get their names from the volcanoes in Hawaii. We disembarked on this walkway and followed it the whole way to the top of the volcano, which turned out to be a substantial amount of stairs, and the only real wildlife we saw were lava lizards. And from the top viewpoint you got fantastic views of the lava fields of Santiago Island. On the way back down we were blocked from getting back on the boat by a sea lion that decided to fall asleep on the only stairs to the island. But luckily it wasn't too fussed with us walking by. Back on the dinghy we had a quick tour of the bay, including Pinnacle Rock, a huge pointy volcanic cone created by an underwater eruption, and one of the island's most distinct features. We threw on our wetsuits and snorkels as it was time to go for a swim. The water temperature was a little chilly, but it was worth it for what we were about to see. Galapagos penguins. These friendly birds are related to the Humboldt penguin of Peru and Chile. Carried to the island by north-flowing currents, and over the years changed their body size to deal with the tropical climate. They weren't bothered in the slightest with us being there, and were swimming directly in front of us without a care in the world. Most of the time they were just looking for fish on the ocean floor, and they were in luck because there was absolutely thousands of them. At that point it was almost time to head back, so we checked out some of the lava lizards and followed around some of the massive crabs, ready for our voyage back to Santa Cruz Island. On the way back we were accompanied by a pod of dolphins, which started out as 1 or 2 and ended up being around 50 or 60, filling the water all around the boat. Overall it was a successful day, so we celebrated with a nice free glass of champagne. And when I say free, I mean it was included in the price of the incredibly expensive tour.
The next day we had a day trip to Pinzon Island, which again was basically just a snorkeling trip. Not ideal for the ear infection situation. But armed with cotton wool, Vaseline, and an exercise resistance band around my head, I was ready to jump in the sea. I forgot to film a lot of footage here, but we saw black-tip sharks, sea lions, a huge stingray, and some giant sea turtles which were longer than me, and its head was human-sized. And of course, lots of cool fish. We then headed back to the accommodation, where I immediately started with food poisoning, again. So while I was laid up resting in bed, Jack decided to head out and have a little explore.
Starting with the Charles Darwin Research Institute, where I got to meet the man himself and check out some of the amazing photography that's been done of the animals on the island. They also had this crazy looking set of bones from a dolphin that had washed up on the shore. They also had loads of information about the HMS Beagle, which was the Navy ship that brought Darwin to the island in the 1800s. The research station also had 2 beaches, which were covered in fields of dark black volcanic rock, and heartbreakingly lots of rock pools filled with wildlife which Beth would have loved, and crabs as far as the eye could see. The other inhabitants of this beach were marine iguanas, the oldest known resident of the islands. They feed on seaweed and marine algae, and to get rid of excess salt from the sea, they have special glands so they can sneeze it out through their nose. They were also what Godzilla was based on in the modern films. I arrived back to the hostel to find a creature also dying on the bed. And sadly for Beth, it was time to leave the comfort of the room and head down to the dock for our ferry to Isabella Island. We waited on the pier alongside some of the sleepy residents, and it looked so appealing that Beth joined them for a quick power nap while we waited for our boat to be boarded. This turned out to be a very smart idea for Beth, as the boat journey was absolutely horrendous, and we were slammed around the cabin for 2 hours straight. So once we arrived on Isabella, it was straight to our accommodation at La Casa de Joel. It was a basic room, but it did come with a shower with hot water, which was fantastic. Beth went straight to sleep, and I went out for a meal and then looked at some flamingos on one of the local lakes.
Luckily the next day I was feeling about 70% better, just in time for the next snorkeling trip to Los Toneles. It took about an hour to get there, stopping by this big rock where we saw lots of Nazca boobies, and then we arrived at Los Toneles, which even without the snorkeling are just pretty nice to look around. But it was time to get in the water, and this was by far our favourite snorkeling trip in the Galapagos. You started off by cutting round these natural tunnels, all formed from volcanic rock, even going underwater, which makes the snorkeling a little more fun. And straight away the sea life was just out of this world. massive schools of weird and wonderful fish, and then within a couple of minutes, stingrays, specifically spotted eagle rays, which have wingspans of up to 3 meters, which were just calmly swimming around at a safe distance, because if you get too close, they can sting. Rest in peace, Steve Irwin. Anyway, we ended up following these round for a bit, and then they took us to where the sea turtles were hanging out. And there were tons of them, all swimming around, minding their own business, and not one bit bothered about the humans swimming around them. The main species here is the Galapagos green sea turtle. Adults can grow up to 1.5 meters long and weigh over 150 kilograms. And pretty much all of these were that big. And they love it at Los Tonnelas because the shallow, calm waters and abundant seagrass and algae make this area a feeding hotspot. And you can kind of see in this video just how big the sea turtle is compared to us. Next up on the sea life spotting, seahorses, or in Espanol, caballito de mar, or in Yorkshire, sea osses. Specifically, Pacific seahorses, also known as giant seahorses, and it's the only seahorse species found in the Galapagos. Interesting fact, they can grow up to 30 centimeters long, but they were a bit boring, so we moved on to the sharks. These ones are white-tip sharks, as you can tell from, well, the white tips. They grow to about 1.5 to 2 meters long, and they're not aggressive. Attacks on humans are virtually unheard of, so we were very safe just stalking them from a distance. It was then time to get out of the water and have a little hike along the rocks, and we realised that the water was so clear you didn't actually need to even snorkel, because you could just see everything from above. And here we finally got to see the blue-footed booby up close, which is a bird that Jack's wanted to see for his whole life, and I would say it's the most iconic bird of the Galapagos. Their blue feet come from carotenoid pigments in their diet, and the brighter their feet are, the healthier the bird is. And here you can see a male performing a high-stepping dance to try and attract a female, which unfortunately didn't work out for him. And then we also got to see these brown noddies, seabirds which are common around this site. The sea was pretty rough on the way back, so the boat was bouncing all over the place, but I was just happily enjoying my apple. And then from the boat we spotted a hammerhead shark in the water, but unfortunately didn't have time to go in and swim with it.
The next morning we jumped on this sketchy bus for our journey up Volcano Sierra Negra. We were told it was going to be a 7k hike, but it ended up being 17k. On the way up there was loads of tortoises hanging around in the bushes, along with lots of rare birds. After 4 kilometers we got our first glimpses of the volcano. Sierra Negra is 10 kilometers across and can be seen from space. Originally it was a 100-meter deep magma chamber, but once the magma disappeared it collapsed in on itself, creating this massive crater. We hiked along the side of the volcano, then stopped for some lunch, before heading on to Volcan Chico, which rather than being another volcano is an extension of Sierra Negra, where the magma under pressure has broken through the Earth's crust. The area was absolutely barren except for a few cactuses, with long lava tubes and twisted rocks all over the place. It felt like you were walking on another planet, but led to these stunning views of Isabella Island leading down to the Pacific Ocean. After we'd taken in the views, we headed back the way we'd came, then stopped for a quick snack with one of the locals. From there we had another 5k hike, which Beth really enjoyed as a boat had hit her in the heel the day before. We made it back to the bus and headed back to town, where we were dropped off at the main beach of Isabella Island. While Beth had a quick nap on the beach, I headed over to the viewpoint, which was guarded by one very sleepy marine iguana. And the views of volcanic rock, blue seas and sandy beaches was worth the trip. We spent the rest of the day napping on the beach and then had an early night.
The next day was a travel day and we had to get up at the disgusting time of 4 AM ready for the ferry to Santa Cruz. Luckily the port was only a 15-minute walk away, but we spent the whole time just psyching ourselves up ready for another horrible ferry ride. We had about 6 hours to kill on Santa Cruz Island, so we decided to go back to the Charles Darwin Research Centre. Jack had already been on his own obviously, but he wanted to show me and go for a guided tour as well. The tour was pretty cool and he showed us different types of cacti, and then he took us to the land tortoises, where they would breed different types to make sure that they don't become extinct. And then once they reach 5 years old, they're a safe enough size so they don't get attacked by predators. So then they're released to the different islands. After this, they took us to see Lonesome George, who was a Pinta Island tortoise, and the last of his kind, who died in 2012, and at one point was the rarest creature in the world. We then stopped by one of the beaches on the way back to the town, where I found this absolutely ginormous crab claw. Then once we were back in the town, it was time to head for the next ferry, where we spotted some local seals making the most of some good resting spots. And then it was time for the horrible ferry journey again. And this is legit what it was like for 2 hours straight. My hair was in a tight bun when we set off. But then we finally arrived in San Cristobal, albeit feeling a little sick from the journey. And the amount of seals on the local beach here next to the ferry port was absolutely mad. So we spent about half an hour as soon as we got off the ferry just watching them. We then checked into our hostel, which was Hostel Nathali, and then had a bit of a chill before going back out again in the evening. They had the UFC on that night, but we didn't even need to watch it, because these seals were putting on a right performance. So after watching a good scrap, we headed out for the $6 meal of the day.
Our final day in the Galapagos would see us do the San Cristobal 360 tour. Our first stop would be Kicker Rock, which is a 150 metre tall volcanic cone in the middle of the ocean that's been eroded away over thousands of years, leaving this massive channel in the centre, and also serves as a nesting spot for the many seabirds. We put on our snorkeling gear and jumped straight in the water, and as soon as we jumped in, we were in for a big surprise. Hammerhead sharks were swimming below us, which was rare at this time of year, as they are usually found deeper down in the water around San Cristobal. And alongside these, we also saw black-tip reef sharks. Luckily for us, both of these species are fairly scared of humans, so we managed to swim away from our encounter without being eaten. After the sharks had swum away, we encountered this massive school of eagle rays, and our guide managed to swim down and get this absolutely fantastic footage. As we watched from the surface, the current pulled us through the two massive rocks, and when we came out the other side, these two sea turtles were waiting for us, along with a few massive schools of fish. At this point we were getting a little bit chilly, and it was time to get out the water, so we swam back to the boat and took our last views of Kicker Rock. En route to our next snorkel location, we stopped off at Cerro Brujo, which is the Galapagos equivalent of Durdle Door. Then it was on to Sardine Bay, where we had the opportunity to swim with a few more turtles, along with some more schools of fish. After we were back on the boat, we were in for another surprise. We saw a huge fin coming out of the water, which turned out to be a humpback whale with her calf. So we matched their course, kept our distance, and just followed them along for 10 minutes. And just in case we lost them, this frigate bird flew over the top to make sure we knew where they were. After rounding the top of San Cristobal, we were joined by these bottlenose dolphin. We sailed along with them until we got to our final stopping point of the trip, a secluded lagoon called Rosa Blanca, which was miles away from civilization, and provided a rest area for many different sea creatures, as well as a nursery for fish. There was another large school of eagle rays as soon as we got in the water, and along the sides of the lagoon were small caves, and if you swam down and poked your head inside, white-tipped reef sharks were resting on the bottom. After this we headed over to the rocky shoreline, where we spotted more green sea turtles grazing on the algae and seagrass that grow in the lagoon. And just before getting out, we were lucky enough to see this large Galapagos stingray. With that, we took off our snorkel gear and headed back to the boat, which was slightly rougher than our previous voyages, as this side of San Cristobal faces out to the open sea. So we journeyed back alongside the other tour boats and watched them get thrown around by the waves.
The next day it was time to leave the Galapagos. It definitely rates as the top place we've ever been for sea life. And while we'd absolutely loved it, we were completely exhausted. So we landed back at Quito that evening, checked back into the secret garden hostel, and picked up the rest of the baggage that we stored in the locker, and then had dinner and a beer before bed. The next day was my birthday. Hey! And we spent it on a bus. This time we went from Quito to Cotopaxi, right next to the national park.
I'll sit it!